holidays, which start tomorrow morning. And when we have holidays in the morning, we want to begin them just early in the evening of the previous day. But I see today it's a little bit mistake. I see again you in this room, and that's why I think that our Russian studies has some chance. It's fine. So today's lecture will be on the problem of war, Second World War, and post-war Russia up till perestroika. Of course, it's a very large distance, historical distance, in the 20th century, but we'll speak not about all history of communist Russia, but only about one line of it. The main direction, which we saw on the previous lecture. This main direction, as you remember, is the idea of the worldwide communist, non-communist, but totalitarian state, which was the real essence of the regime, which we name communist regime, but in this the same name, communist, is a mistake. You see, communists made a lot of fictions, a lot of false ideas. For example, we call this country Soviet Union or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But the idea of Soviets is absolutely false idea. Soviets as a councils of people elected by the workers and peasants worked only in 1917, maybe in the beginning of 1918. Then it was only a declaration of totalitarian regime. It was even a term to drive some decree to drive through Soviets. It means that communist leaders accepted some idea, and that's because it's necessary to have some political, juridical verification of it. It's necessary to say that it was accepted by Soviets. But Soviets was only a failed symbol of communist totalitarian dictatorship. The same is the term communists. We speak about communist dictatorship, communist state, communist ideology. It's a mistake. There was no communist ideology in this regime. Communism was only a false term used by the rulers of this country. It's a problem because, as you remember, maybe if you read Confucius, this ancient Chinese thinker, when he was asked by one of the princes of China, from what you start your reforms? From the change of names, answered Confucius. Why? Because false names ought to be changed to the real one. And the real, because there was no communism at all. Communism is public property to all resources, but it was never any public property. It was the property of very small elite, maybe 12 persons. Sometimes, as in the period of Stalinist dictatorship, it was a rule of one person. In other, it was triumvirates, triumvirates and as other variants. So, if we speak in real terms, if we follow Confucius and give proper name to this regime, it was absolute totalitarian gang of people who was never elected by anybody and who ruled with no law, with no adaptation by some popular vote, by popular opinion, public opinion, only by their will. And there were two main principles and two main goals of this gang. As each gang, it think on two things. As each gang, and gangster gang, it's in mafia, only two things: power, their personal power over people, and the increase of this power over the other parts of the world, groups of society, etc. So the real plot, the real sense of the regime, which was established in Russia after the Civil War of 1917-1922, was a gang of bandits, gang of robbers, who use, and they organize this gang as many gangs, for example, as Italian mafia, with translation of power. So if some leader died, or was killed, or was dismissed because of some reasons, this gang elect new one, but not by democratical means, of course. And that's why, for example, American Chicago gangsters or Italian Sicilian mafia can survive for many decades, maybe for the century. Just the same thing is with Russian, this regime which we name communist. But since it's necessary to use some term, I use term communist, Bolsheviks regime, but you ought not to suppose that this regime is really is a regime of communist ideology. Nothing like this. So the main idea of this regime was the increasing the empire. As an ultimate goal, the worldwide empire. But the first decades of this communist state turned to be not very successful. As I have already told, because of their zeal for power, their attitude to economics was catastrophic. And Russian economy, industry and agriculture was in a very poor position. But the main idea of Stalin, who turned to be, after the 1929, the monarch, the autocratic person in Russia, was to build a strong army for possibility to catch the countries which were not under the communist rule. As you remember, Lenin wanted to annex Poland, Germany in 1920, but he failed to do so. He was not able to do so. But Stalin wanted to again make this attempt. And the situation was very positive for him, because in neighboring country, in Germany, Hitler came to power and wanted also to rebuild the empire, which was lost during the First World War. He dreamed about revenge, and he wanted to take territories which were taken from Germany during the, according to the Versailles agreements, and maybe to go further. He think about great German nation, some Lebensraum on the east, in Russia, but first of all about the unification of German-speaking countries. And Stalin had his plan. His plan was rather simple, but in the same way rather casuistic, rather maybe complicated. He wanted to give Germany possibility to launch the war against neighboring countries, first of all against Poland and Czechoslovakia. And he knows that former Entente countries, France and Great Britain, would support Poland and Czechoslovakia, and the new war broke out, and in this war both sides, in the terrible, difficult war like First World War, both sides would have great losses, and as an end of this war, Stalin started his invasion to Europe, and since both Germany, France, Great Britain were in very terrible condition after this long-time war, he will be the third who will happy to struggle, and he will be the third one. And he will liberate countries from bourgeois regime, as he officially proclaimed, and made all Europe, or maybe worldwide, his empire. So it was his idea. And, but Hitler ought to start the war. That's why he supported him in this direction. When Munich Agreement was accepted, and as you remember, Czechoslovakian state was dismembered, Stalin was calm. It's very good. He supposed that Hitler possessed this country. It's a start, a good start for his aggression to the West. Then Hitler was in a very peculiar position because he was sure that it will be impossible for him to struggle with Poland and with Great Britain and France, and maybe with the Soviet Union, who also had an agreement with Poland. But as you know very well, Stalin signed agreement in Moscow, a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, in which he not only allowed Hitler to start his aggression, but also demarcate new border between two empires in Baltics region, in Poland, even in Romania. Before this agreement, on the 19th of August, Stalin had some meeting with other leaders of his regime. Maybe it was a Council of Politburo, we don't know exactly. It was secret and no documents are open till now. But there was some meeting. Meeting formal or maybe meeting by phone, by selector connection, we don't know. But on this meeting, Stalin said that our task is to help Western countries to struggle with each other, and we ought not to go to the war. We ought to wait up till Western countries lose their strength. But Hitler was happy as a child, and after the signing of this treaty, he cried happily on the 24th of August that now all Europe is in my hands. I am sorry, but even Hitler was naive. And he didn't know the real strength of a Russian army. At that time, Russian army was much stronger than German one. In the end of August 1939, Germany had 52.5 divisions, and Russia have 147. Germany had 36,000 artillery guns, but Russia had 55.8. Germany had 3,004 tanks, but Russia had 21,000. And Germany had 4 and 3 aircrafts, and Russia had 11,000. So Russia at that time was much stronger than Germany. But Stalin preferred not to struggle. And he occupied his part of Poland without any, almost without any fights. Then he occupied Baltic states, but in Finland he failed to do the same. Finnish people refused to sign this treaty as Baltic states, and the Winter War started. And this Winter War in some way changed the reflections of Hitler. In this Winter War, as we name Russian-Finnish War, in this Winter War, it occurred that Russian army, rather very large, is not very strong. In the beginning of the war, Stalin said that to crush Finland, not a serious task, but it occurred that Russian Communist army ought to struggle with Finnish army for 3.5 months and did not crush Finnish army. The Moscow Agreement was agreement between Mannerheim state and Stalin regime. Though Stalin proclaimed on the 1st of December of 1939 that bourgeois government of Finland disappeared and nobody knows where it is. But with this bourgeois government, he ought to sign a Moscow Treaty in March 1940. It was first very unpleasant for Stalin sign. His army is not strong, and the reason for this is clear for you. Communist officers and generals were not very good educated as, for example, Finnish or German or Russian revolutionary officers, but they had some knowledge of war. But Stalin, killed the majority of Russian Soviet generals and officers before the war. So it was a lot of tanks and aircrafts, but there were no capable officers and well-educated soldiers also, because soldiers were former peasants, and these peasants were from collectivized villages, and these peasants hated the communist regime. As you remember, the general census of 1937, the majority of people declared that they were religious persons. They believe in God. That's why they were against the atheistic communist regime. So this war showed Stalin and Hitler also, and all the world, that Russian army is not so strong as it was supposed. It was supposed it's the strongest army in the continental Europe, in the whole Europe, but it occurred that it is not so. Another moment, very unpleasant for Stalin, was the start of war on the Western Front. So struggle between Germany and France and Great Britain. He supposed that the war will be very long and very exhaustive, but German army succeeded to crush French army in 5 weeks. In 5 weeks. Stalin was afraid that German army is much stronger than he supposed, and his army is not so strong. That's why he decided to continue this peaceful period and not to start war, though he knew very well that Hitler, when he was unsuccessful in defeating Great Britain in this struggle for England, battle for England, he began to think about attack to his communist Soviet state. And he started to prepare his own war against Hitler. As we know now, Stalin changed the date of the beginning of war, but he said many times to generals, to his close circle, that he planned to start war with Germany. It would be preventive war, he said. And this war ought to be done not in the Soviet Union, but out of the borders of the country, in Europe. We know very well these plans now, and the final data was the 12th of July 1941. Hitler knew about it, and he planned to start war on the 15th of May 1941. But the events in Serbia You remember that. And so in May, pro-British coup d'etat occurred. Changed his plans. He decided to ruin Serbia and Greece, and only after this to go to Russia. That's why he lost 5 warm weeks of the spring and June of 1941, and started the war on the 22nd of June. This war again shows the whole world the weakness of Russian army. A number of aircrafts, tanks, guns were much more than in German army. Only at that time, manpower of Germany on the Eastern Front was more than that of Russian army, maybe 1.3. I mean, if Russian army is 1, German is 1.3. But not in technique means. But all technique means were unuseful in this war, because nobody in Russia could use it, almost nobody, of course, used them properly. And on the first months of war, communist army lost all battles, and you see, find itself near the walls of Moscow. On the First World War, German army never penetrated into Russian territory more than to western parts of Ukraine and western parts of Belarus and western parts of Baltic provinces. Riga was captured only in 1917 during the revolution. But now Riga was captured in 3 weeks after the beginning of war. And in 1.5 months, almost all Ukraine and Belarus and Baltic region was under German control. So once again, communist regime found itself not so strong as it was supposed. Ideology meant nothing, absolutely. And people didn't want to die for this regime. More than 3.5 million Russian soldiers decided not to struggle and surrendered. This change of situation turned to be in the second half of 1942. It's necessary to say that 1942 was really the year of change, not only in Eastern Front, but also in Western one, and in global war. In the beginning of the 1942, the majority of people suppose that Germany, with its allies and with Japan, would be successful. And everybody think about some peace treaty with aggressors. But at that time, 3 events occurred. I mean, battle on the atoll Midway between Japan Navy and United States Navy. And you know that in this Navy battle, United States were victorious. The second one is a battle on El Alamein in August of 1942, where British army was successful over German, Italian army. And the third one is the struggle on Stalingrad, on the battle on Stalingrad, in the end of 1942. In these 3 struggles, German army and his allies and Japan were crushed. But it was only the beginning. And in Russia, there was a change in different way. Russian people start to understand that they struggle not for communist regime. They struggle for their lives, for their houses, for their destiny. They don't struggle for Stalin. They struggle for themselves. And after this change in mind, on the one hand, they wanted to change life in Russia after the war, for example, to dismiss collective farms, to return to farmer peasant life. And on the other hand, they want to crush the enemy. So when the war was over in 1945, Stalin saw new Russian people. Though the losses of war was terrible in all countries, you remember that the total amount of victims of war of the died people was about 80 million. And in Russia, we up till now discuss about this figure, not less than 27 millions, but maybe even much more. Nevertheless, Stalin saw new Russian people, those who returned from this terrible war. They turned to be new people with new brains, with new destiny. They wanted to live in Russia, not in the communist Soviet Union. They didn't believe in communist ideology. They think about their own new life, and they saw Europe. Very serious thing is that these simple soldiers and even civic persons who are taken by Germans to labor work, to labor front to Germany, they saw European style of life. And they understood that simple people in Europe live much better than they. That all Russian communist propaganda was a lie. And they began to explain their friends, their wives, maybe their children, their neighbors, about this new discovery, that Western world is more prosperous than Russia. And in this situation, it was not so difficult, not so impossible for Stalin to lose even power, because many generals, even marshals, had the same ideas. And he decided to use three new means to preserve power. First, of course, terror. Terror began again after the Second World War in a very great level. Many people were arrested, very many. Maybe millions of people were arrested and taken to labor camps. Another mean was starvation. He again used this method, which was used in the beginning of 30s, when he wanted to force people, peasants, to go to kolkhoz, to go to collective farms. So in 1946, he confiscated almost all grain from peasants. And in this terrible situation of hunger, he refused to give even one golden dollar to buy something for simple people, for peasants. After the war, Russia had a lot of gold resources. He confiscated all gold resources of Eastern Europe. But he refused to give something. And this famine was terrible, and about 1,040,000 people and 400,000 people were died because of famine and some epidemic, some illness as a result of this famine. But not only this. He used also ideological form. Before the Second World War, the main idea was communist revolution in the whole world. In the time of the Second World War, he decided to use real Russian imperialistic ideas. He legalized church in September 1943 and all other religions, but under his strict KGB control. He allowed to have uniform of Tsarist style with these golden epaulets. He, in 1946, changed the name of main ministerials. You remember that in the Soviet Union there was not ministers, there were people's commissars, nalkomy, народные комиссариаты, people's commissars. It was a revolutionary investigation. But now he returned to pre-revolutionary name, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Home Affairs, etc. He also began to use uniform even in the civic part of bureaucracy, not as it was in pre-revolutionary Russia. And phraseology also. All Russian history was accepted up till the First World War, but not in the sense of liberation movement. The Tsars who wanted to liberate people, for example, Alexander I, Alexander II, were not themes of historical propaganda, but the great invaders, as Peter the Great, Ekaterina II, they were in some way elements of positive Stalinist propaganda. This nationalistic mood was very strong, and almost immediately it had also anti-Semitic overtones, because the struggle against cosmopolitanism. The word cosmopolitanism meant Semitism, Jewish people. The struggle against cosmopolites started in the post-war years. It, of course, had an effect, and many officers and generals of Russian army, many Russian people remembered this imperial past and again wanted to follow Stalin as a national, not communist leader, but national leader. So Stalin it was even a moment in the end of 1946 when he, I suppose, he think about re-establishment of monarchy with him as a Tsar, but he understood that it's, and that's why he wanted to take some immigrants of White Russia into the country. But he very soon he understood that it's of not great use, because communist movement which supported Stalin as a communist leader, of course, never will support Stalin. I mean, worldwide communist movement never would support Stalin as a Tsar. So after the Council of Communist Parties in Pátá in Poland, in southern Poland, in January 1947, he decided to organize two ideological phases of his regime. For foreign communist world, he was a communist leader, for whom he is a leader of Russian nationalists, with some elements of communist phraseology only, but not very great. But it was also another mean to establish his power over the country. He began to prepare a new war against Western world. After the victorious Second World War, he began, maybe after the Berlin crisis of 1947, he began to think about new war, nuclear war. And in 1951, in January 1951, there was a secret meeting of the leaders of communist states, I mean Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, with their generals and with Stalin staff, in which they prepared new war with Europe. All documents are secret up till now. But from some recollections and memoirs of East European leaders and generals, we had some information about this meeting and about the plans. Stalin planned to launch this war not later than in the beginning of 1954. In the beginning of 1954. And all directions of assault was fixed. After this meeting, maybe there were another meetings, and this idea ought to organize his empire, and again made Stalinist empire not only empire of the eastern part of Europe, but of all the Europe in future. But this idea maybe was the fatal for Stalin, because his circle, people around him in Kremlin elite, they didn't want this new war. They understood very well that this war will have its result in nuclear devastation, nuclear disappearance of the Soviet Union and maybe of all the world. And they were afraid very much. and you know that in the middle of 1950, Korean War started. In July 1950, Korean War started, and Stalin prepared for the World War, New World War. But he died, and nobody knows if his death was natural or it was inspired by his friends who drank vodka and wine with him on his Kuntsev dacha on the 28th on the night from 28th to of February to the 1st of March. 29th of February, it was the last day of February, 29th of February of to 28th of February to the 1st of March. And he died on the 5th, as you remember, on the 5th of March. Immediately after this, it's very interesting. So, Stalin, I don't tell you about all these preparations. It was building a great navy. It was organized new missiles, new nuclear bombs, new aircrafts. Almost 90% of new investments were in the direction of military industry after the 1949. People live in terrible conditions with no possibility to make it better. But all money of the great country used for military purposes at these years, as the last years of Stalinist regime. All people who were arrested before the war, during the war, and then liberated were arrested again, not to have any confrontation to his new principles. And many people suppose that he will organize new 1937, new great terror. He wants to organize new great terror. That's why maybe he was killed, or maybe he died himself, we don't know. But immediately after his death, great changes occurred. You remember that the first government of post-Stalinist Soviet Union was a government of 3 persons, of Malenkov as a prime minister, Beria as his first vice prime minister and head of Ministry of Home Affairs, and Khrushchev as a leader of Communist Party. And they immediately stopped Korean War. Immediately. And Korean War was on one step before nuclear war. They, when the Korean leader Kim Il-sung came to Moscow to the ceremony of burying Stalin, it was 9th of March, he was told by Malenkov that it's necessary to stop Korean War immediately. Immediately. Kim Il-sung was surprised. Chinese leaders, Mao Zedong, was surprised and was maybe anticipated this idea. But what to do? Communist Russia was the was the strongest country and the main supporter of this war. And they stopped this war. After this, communist leaders gave the idea to give Austria neutral status. And in 1955, all occupational forces were left Austrian state. Beria even gave an idea to give the same neutral status to Germany, but he, as you remember, he was arrested and killed in the end of the 1953, and after this Germany continued to be divided into communist GDR and the German Federative Republic. But Khrushchev tried to establish good relations with Western Germany and returned German prisoners of war back to Germany. Only in 1956 he did so. All peoples who were expelled from their lands after the Second World War, I mean Chechens, Kalmyks, all peoples except Crimean Tatars and Germans were returned to their land in Caucasus and in other regions. And Khrushchev changed the main idea. He began to establish good relations with the United States also in these first years of his rule. But, and he tried to change the main principles of communist state. He continued to think about aggression, about worldwide state, but he decided to improve the level of life of simple people. And he did much in this field. And he also returned all Gulag prisoners, almost all Gulag prisoners, back to normal life. He liberated them. I remember my father always told me that Khrushchev did very good things. He stopped the war in Korea, he liberated Gulag prisoners, he started to build cheap houses for simple people, because before him there were almost no place to live for many people, and people live in, you see, pre-revolutionary flats which were divided into separate rooms. Many families lived in one flat. It was a terrible thing. And Khrushchev tried to change this, but not to change the main principle, the principle of aggression, the principle of increasing the empire. And because he did not finish this principle, with this principle, the relations between him and Western world start to spoil, and Berlin crisis, new Berlin crisis, started in 1958. Then Berlin Wall was erected. Then Cuba crisis in 1962, in October 1962, which again turns the whole world on the eve of nuclear war. And after all these deeds, Khrushchev was dismissed from his post in October 1964, and new leader Brezhnev again start to pacify the communist regime and to establish new good relations with the Western countries without peaceful principles in its essence. He continued to think about this increasing of empire, but more accurate. You know that events in Czechoslovakia in 1968 maybe spoiled these good dreams, and he occupied Czechoslovakia, and after this he in some way changed his ideas, but only in some ways, because in 1975 he signed Helsinki Treaty of this fixation of the borders in Europe, peaceful coexistence, and even humanitarian, the third branch, the third basket of humanitarian questions. He even signed these principles. But he continued to increase empire whenever it was possible. And it was possible in Africa, where Portuguese empire collapsed in 1974, and Brezhnev started to organize control over Angola, Mozambique, and other Portuguese colonies, and with the help of Cuba communist army. Then in 1979, maybe without his agreement, a war in Afghanistan started. It was the last war of the Soviet Union, but it was also, of course, aggressive, imperialistic war, for sure. It's necessary to say that at that time, relations between China, communist China and communist Russia, spoiled, and many of us suppose that the new war would be with China, not with Western countries. Maybe this reason also enforced Brezhnev to preserve good relations with Western countries. He had an enemy on the east, communist China. And when Brezhnev died on the 9th of, just in these days we celebrated the 40th anniversary of his death. He was died on the 9th of November 1982. In some new attempts to control power in Russia, it was Andropov, then Chernenko, leaders of Communist Party of Russia. But of course, the communist system was in the state of decline. Everybody in Russia saw it. Russia, communist state, was not strong at that time. Difficulties in economics was great. War in Afghanistan was not successful at all, and was unpopular. And when this spring meeting of Communist Party in 1985 occurred, and new leader Mikhail Gorbachev was elected, it was a surprise for everybody, but nobody knows what policy he would follow. But I remember that from his first phrases on this meeting, Communist Party meeting, plenum, it was named. I remember that I understood that some changes will be. And these changes were great, really great. For the first time and the last time in the history of communist Russia, a leader of Russia began to speak about worldwide values. That the worldwide values, all mankind values, they ought to be greater. They ought to supervise class values and class goals. So socialist, communist ideology of empire disappeared. Maybe during the meetings in Reykjavik with Reagan, with President Bush, George Bush on Malta in 1989, new principles of peaceful coexistence, new principles of relaxation of international tension were proclaimed openly. And really, the nuclear arsenals were decreased by 50% in the United States and the Soviet Union at that time. So for the first time in the whole history of Russia, communist Russia, idea of empire, idea of worldwide communist state, idea of struggle for the predominance all over the world disappeared. This was done by Mikhail Gorbachev. Of course, his foreign policy was only one of the sides of his policy. He also tried to make Russian Soviet society more liberal, more open, free. These ideas of independent mass media, idea of economical plurality, all done by him. Because it's impossible to change the main principle of foreign policy and not to change home policy. It's impossible. Both aspects are in very close coexistence. When Gorbachev did so, he forgot one simple thing. And it's necessary to add that Gorbachev really believed in communist ideology, in Leninist principles. He didn't know them well, but he believed in them. And his main idea was back to Lenin. If he really wanted to return to Lenin, it was a terrible thing. It was Lenin's red terror, Lenin's confiscation of all property. But for him, Lenin was some very good, rose and fluffy man, you see. Of course, it was a mistake. But his much more serious mistake was another one. He supposed that the situation in the Soviet Union, and maybe even in the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, is a normal situation. People live in peace, in friendship by their heart, and not by the terrible strength of KGB control. He was really shocked when he saw that when he decreased this level of KGB control, ethnical conflicts occurred immediately between Azerbaijans and Armenians, between Abkhazians and Georgians, in Central Asia, between peoples of Central Asia, between Moldavians and Russian-speaking people in Moldavia. He was surprised. I remember it very well because at that time I was already in some political process and had contacts with some of his close colleagues. He didn't know what to do, but it was very easy to understand that if let us recollect the beginning of the lecture. If the communist state in a real sense is gang, the only mean of unity in gang is terror. If you decrease or annihilate this terror, everything began to ruin. In normal society, there are a lot of horizontal level connections. We maybe don't see them, but they are in each society, normal society. These connections of self-government, connections of private trade relations, connections of parliamentary elections, etc. But in communist gang system, there were no horizontal connections at all, horizontal relations. The first goal of communist regime was to liquidate all these horizontal connections, organize only vertical system of control and rule. And Russian people lost all their quality, all their knowledge of living in normal society during these 70 years of terrible gang dictatorship. I may say that even in Eastern Europe, even in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in Hungary, in Bulgaria, people lost many things in this field. And it was very difficult because of this to re-establish normal state everywhere. But there was one difference. In communist countries of Europe, all people remember the pre-communist past, or maybe young people heard stories of their parents and grandparents. And in Russia, this connection with normal life was absolutely broken, And Gorbachev didn't understand this. And he believed that he will change some economic and political forms in foreign politics, in home politics, and everything will improve. But nothing like this. In international relations, of course, in the relations with normal states, as United States, Great Britain, NATO states, relations really improved. But in inner relations, in home relations, situation was dramatic. And as a result of this dramatic situation, Gorbachev lost his power. Soviet Union was dismembered, and this development to the new prosperous future stopped for many years. And what it meant for post-communist Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I will tell you and will think about it on the next and last my lecture, a week, in the next Wednesday. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And are there any questions? Yes.
I do think Gorbachev lost the first 3 presidential elections in Russia.
Why Gorbachev lost?
Lost
His
so much.
Yes, attitude to him was so negative in today's Russia also. Is this your question? Yes. Why he lost? I tried to explain that Gorbachev and maybe all of us, you see, it was a problem of living inside the ship, inside the communist ship. We didn't see the real situation. We didn't understand at that time that communist regime built very specific form of organization and control. It was typically gang controlled by force, by terror, and people, for example, Armenians and Azerbaijanis lived in peace with each other, not because they believe in communist ideals of peaceful coexistence of peoples, but because they know that each attempt to do something against official regime immediately continued by arrest, by prison, and something like this. People didn't write, for example, some aggressive articles, not because they didn't want to do so, but because they were forbidden to do so. And when Gorbachev decided to liberate the country, all these evils, which were not improved, but they were hidden, all these evils appeared again. And Gorbachev had no knowledge, and maybe I suppose nobody could do so. Gorbachev had no experience to modify society. Society is not a, you see, artificial thing. Society is something living, and it's necessary to educate society, to prepare society, to make it more and more capable, more and more serious, and it's a mistake to think that there is some teacher of society. That society teach themselves in a real experience of interhuman relations, intersocial relations. That's why, for example, in Great Britain and the United States, you may see very complicated system of human and social relations, not political even ones. And politics are over these relations, and this politics also made by people. The main tragedy of this Russian Revolution was that all these normal relations between people were distracted, prohibited, and people who were capable to follow them, to organize them, were physically killed or expelled from the Soviet Union. So Russia had no this social system of democracy at that time. And Gorbachev didn't understand this. And that's why his attempt was not positive. He lost the country, and people didn't change during his 6-year rule. They continue to be aggressive, they continue to be egoistic, and they had no knowledge of establishing horizontal social and political relations. I think this is the main reason of his loss.
Okay.
Professor Zubov, I was interested by that remark of yours that the decrease in the violent control in Russia resulted in all these ethnic struggles. Do you think that this situation could be compared to what happened in Yugoslavia after Josip Broz Tito died? You know, because there were two different rulers, of course, but both somehow held the, you know, very conflicting nationalities together. Absolutely. Do you think you can compare it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because all the nations of Yugoslavia lived in peace, not because they loved each other greatly, but because the communist regime was very strict in home. It was maybe more liberal abroad, and economic relations a little bit more. But at home, and in international relations, I mean, relations between nationalities, it was very, very severe. And Tito was, of course, a charismatic leader who controlled everything by force and by his maybe some capabilities. And after him, primitive nationalists occurred who spoiled everything immediately. And you know that Yugoslavia, as Milosevic, for example, and Yugoslavia immediately turned to civil, terrible ethnical war.
Добрый вечер, Андрей Борисович.
It's better to speak English.
I was about to. I was just... well, 12 years ago, when I was studying in Ural State University, there was a theory that's been highly criticized by many of our teachers. And it was the one of Mr. Viktor Suvorov, displayed in his book, Operation M.
Yes.
And it was indeed saying that Stalin was planning to start a war and Hitler just did it earlier. So this particular theory was highly criticized by many of our teachers. On contrary, they insisted that he never planned to start any war. So my question is, what do you think is this opinion based on? What made them think that Stalin never planned to start a war?
Now maybe nobody among serious scholars support this idea that Stalin never planned the assault war. Very easy reason is that each country ought to prepare to have war not in their homeland. It's better to have war. If war occurred, it's better to that this war will be out of the borders of the country. So the idea of the war in Europe at that time was not aggression in itself. It was form of military and political strategy. The problem is that for Stalin, it was a method of socialization, conquer Europe. For him, it was imperial idea, and we have all documents now that not only this war was planned as a form of some military idea. This war was planned as a political strategy. And there is enough documents now. Though some archives are absolutely secret up till now, we have enough documents to say about this. In my book, The History of Russia in the 20th Century, we analyze many of these documents. And in you, edition, 3-volume edition. I'm sorry it was not in Czech language, it was only in Russian. We improved many moments, we add many facts, and you may read it and see the arguments. The idea of Viktor Suvorov was, you see, it was his naive reflection. But his naive reflection was practically right. Practically right. He had no documents in his hands, only some articles of newspapers and his logic. But he was right in principle. Now we know much more details on the same field.
Good evening, Mr. Zubov. I would like to ask you about why Politburo elected Gorbachev, because you described it as a gang, and they
Yes, it's a good question, and I tried to explain it. It was a gang, and this gang understood that the generation of rulers who ruled Russia before Gorbachev, this generation turned to be physically old. They began to die one by one at that time. And not only heads of Politburo, the first secretaries, but also the members of Politburo. And they decided that it's necessary to elect somebody younger, and to elect somebody from the new generation of 50 years old persons, not 70-year-old persons. And there were only two persons in Politburo who were young at that time. It was Romanov, head of St. Petersburg party organization, and Gorbachev. And Gorbachev looked more simple, more naive. And these old lines of Communist Party decide that we elect rather naive peasant boy to continue to rule the country by his hands. Because Romanov was strong, a very dictator-minded person, and they understood that if we elect Romanov, he will not allow us to continue to drive the car of the Soviet regime. And that's why they decided, it was a mistake, of course. It was the same mistake which was done by Yeltsin when he decided to give Putin a chance to be a new leader of Russia. He also supposed he's rather naive, not very capable, and people like, for example, Berezovsky will continue to rule the country practically. But things turned to be very different. And of course it was a bon chance for Russia that not Romanov, who was totally the same, absolutely the same person as persons of the previous generation, but Gorbachev was elected. And then you see what had happened. So,
okay, so
I think that the last question.
Hello, Andrej Borisovich.
Hello.
In the last lecture, we talked a little bit about Lavrentiy Beria and his possible aspirations to democratize the society of Russia. And I want to ask you if you think that it could be the reason why, after Stalin's death, he was arrested and executed.
Yes. Maybe you catch from this lecture that the idea not to democratize of Russia, of course, but to improve international relations. It was the idea of all people among Stalin because they were afraid of new nuclear war. They prefer to to normalize political situation, to make this war impossible. And Beria was one of them. And since they struggle for power between each other, I mean Malenkov, Khrushchev, Beria, they understood very well that the person who will be supported by common folk, by simple people, had more chances for be a leader of the country. That's why Beria planned to stop terror, to open prisons, to liberate these Gulag people himself. He did so. He arrested, he tortured, he murdered a lot of people, and now he wants to change all this because he wants to protect his power by common folk, by simple people. It's very easy to understand that simple people continue to play a great role even in totalitarian states. Of course, it's a passive role, but it's rather a serious one. And Malenkov did the same. If Beria opened prisons, Malenkov, as a prime minister, returned some land to the peasants. He increased these pieces of land which were in private possession of peasants. And for many decades, peasants recollect Malenkov as Tsar Alexander II, that he gave us land. You see? And Khrushchev did another thing. He, of course, organized the 20th Council of the Party, and he said that Stalin was a bad guy. He was a bad guy. It was shocked by many people in party circles, but it was supported by simple people who remembered very well what Stalin was in practice. So each of them struggled with other by using the, if you like, public opinion. Public opinion. And Beria one of them. Of course, it's impossible to believe that Beria was a good person with some positive democratic ideas, nothing like this. He was an awful person, but rather clever one. And these gang leaders always are clever, but diabolically clever persons, you see. Because if they are not clever, it will be possible for them to be leaders. They are not stupid persons, even Khrushchev, who looked very simple guy, but he was a clever person. But it's a long story. Yes. Thank you very much, dear friend.